Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special public lecture. My name is Bob Ward. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I'm your chair for this evening. We're very lucky this evening to have Professor Michael Mann, possibly one of the, I would think probably the most famous climate scientist in the world at the moment, for all the amount of work he does in engaging with politicians and the public. And we're very lucky to have Mike here today to talk about his new book, The New Climate War, just to prove I've got a copy, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. I'm going to start with a bit of housekeeping. Then I'll do a little bit of an introduction to Mike. So the housekeeping is that Mike is going to talk for about 45 minutes about his book, and then we'll go into a kind of Q&A for 45 minutes. We will finish precisely at 8 p.m. UK time as a hard stop. If you want to ask a question during the course of the talk, you can do it through the Q&A function which is probably at the bottom of your screen. It's very helpful, as well as making sure that it's a question rather than a statement, that you maybe put your name and where you're located in as well, just to make sure we know a bit about you. And you'll be able to vote on each other's questions. And when it comes to the Q&A session, I will focus on the most popular questions. So do vote for your favorite questions as well as submitting your own questions. The chat function you will see is just for messages from the organizers to tell you about the logistics of the evening. So don't put your questions in the chat function, as I will not be picking them up from there. So the Q&A function, I'll remind you later about putting your questions in there. And so let me just mention that we are recording this. And so it will be available afterwards on the Grantham website. It's also being live streamed through the Grantham Research Institute's YouTube channel. So let me just say a little bit about Mike. I'm not going to go through all of his very many honors, but just to mention that he's the Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State University. He has joint appointments in the Department of Geosciences and the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute. He's also director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center. He has a long list of achievements and awards, most recently elected to the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. He has a long and distinguished track record, not just as a researcher, but as an outstanding communicator. And we're very lucky to have him here tonight to talk about his new book. So I'm going to, at this stage, hand over and invite Mike. You're very welcome. Over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Bob. I really appreciate the kind introduction and your hosting this webinar along with the Grantham Institute. And thanks to all of you who are 200 plus folks there in the audience that are in attendance. We're going to have, I'll start out and sort of give my take on where things stand right now when it comes to the climate crisis and our efforts to address the crisis. And we'll try to keep 45 minutes, as we discussed, for Q&A, because I find that the discussion, the Q&A is where the most interesting stuff happens. So let me now share my screen, and I will begin with the presentation, the title of which mirrors, of course, my new book. It just came out in the UK last week, How to Win the New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, based on my book, The New Climate War. Now, what the book really is about is, the evolution from sort of hard climate change denial, and we see very little of it now because the impacts of climate change are playing out in real time. They're impossible to deny. And so we've seen a shift in the strategy used by fossil fuel interests and those advocating for their agenda to prevent or attempt to prevent the needed transition away from fossil fuels using other tactics, often more insidious and nefarious tactics to block any meaningful action on climate. So let me start out by just sort of talking about the projections. And I'm not going to use the latest projections of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or climate model projections that I've published on. I'm going to use the climate model projections of ExxonMobil, the world's largest fossil fuel company, back in the early 1980s, when their own team of scientists were actually using models that were crude by today's standards to make their own future projections. And those projections, they put the IPCC to shame, frankly, because what is so amazing about ExxonMobil is that they were not able to predict the warming effect of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. They were in essence able to predict the actual concentration of carbon dioxide that we would see in the atmosphere right now. In other words, they were able to predict that they would be successful in their efforts to prevent any meaningful action on climate change, to keep us addicted to fossil fuels so that we would elevate the concentration of CO2 to nearly 420 parts per million. And they estimated that that would lead to a warming of a little more than 1 degree Celsius, what we have in fact seen. Now, that team of scientists, that report was buried. It was eventually released. It was leaked some years ago. ExxonMobil got rid of that team, that scientific division, and instead of coming forward, instead of coming clean, going public and saying, look, we have a problem and the impacts could be catastrophic, because by the way, that's the word that was used by ExxonMobil's own scientists in that report, that the impacts of climate change could in fact be catastrophic if we didn't act. Well, that wasn't what they did. They didn't come out, they didn't come clean. Instead, they engaged in a multi-million, in fact, now arguably into the billions of dollars disinformation campaign to discredit the very science and the scientific projections that their own scientists had secretly validated. Now, if we had acted 2 decades ago, when we already knew we had a problem, when the IPCC had already said that there was clearly a detectable human impact on the climate, if we had acted then, you can see what this emissions curve would look like. If we're trying to avoid crossing the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we're very close to now, and which will lead to the worst impacts of climate change, we would have been able to ramp our carbon emissions down fairly gently, as this graph shows. On the other hand, what have more than 2 decades of inaction bought us? They've bought us a much steeper descent down this curve now. If we are to avert 1.5 degrees Celsius dangerous planetary warming, we now have to bring our carbon emissions down far more dramatically. So we have, once again, fossil fuel interests to thank for their efforts to block meaningful action decades ago, when it would have been much easier to make this transition. And the impacts, again, they're not subtle. We see them play out in real time here in the United States and Europe, deadly record heat waves. And I'll talk about the recent cold a little bit later, because no, that doesn't disprove all of the science of the past 2 centuries that establishes human-caused warming of the planet. We'll talk about the current weather and the relationship that might in fact have with climate change. But the point is, we can see the impacts now playing out in real time. You know, the extreme weather events, unprecedented heat waves and wildfires and floods and droughts and superstorms like we've seen in recent summers. That is the face of climate change now, and we all recognize it. I did a sabbatical last year in Australia. I was there for the Black Summer, perhaps the most dramatic climate change induced array of extreme weather that we have ever seen. The entire continent literally almost engulfed by bushfires. I was for that. I was there for that, and I saw it happen in real time. Ironically, I was in Australia to study the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events in Australia. I arrived instead to watch it actually play out in real time. So the extreme weather events have continued on. We just saw the hottest temperature ever reliably recorded on the planet this last summer here in the United States in Death Valley, California. And our own wildfires, unprecedented wildfires in the Western US, in Colorado. Let's talk about the hurricane season. We saw the most active hurricane season on record, 30 named storms. I didn't think we would see that active a season in my lifetime. We've never seen that many storms. Well into the Greek alphabet, we ran out of letters and had to go into the Greek alphabet. Our own team actually came the closest. There are nearly a dozen teams now that make preseason forecasts of the hurricane season related to climate factors that may or may not be conducive to an active season. We predicted as many as 24 named storms. That was the highest total that anybody predicted prior to the beginning of the season. And basically for two reasons. There was an incipient La Nina event, the opposite of El Nino, and that makes conditions a little more conducive to Atlantic hurricanes. But the main contribution to our forecast was the unusual warmth, the anomalous warmth of the tropical Atlantic Ocean. And unfortunately, even we underpredicted just how devastating a season that we would see. There is a relationship between climate change, the warming of the oceans, these very warm ocean temperatures, and the increased hurricane activity we've seen. Expressed to some extent in the number of named storms we saw in the Atlantic, but even more significantly in the intensity of storms, in the record intensity of Atlantic hurricanes, typhoons, and hurricanes around the world that are being supercharged by the additional ocean heat from human-caused warming. Strongest landfalling tropical cyclone in recorded history, again, just last year in the form of this Goni, which beat out the previous record holder, Haiyan, as the most intense landfalling hurricane on record. So whether you're in the Northern Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere, the Atlantic Basin, the Pacific Basin, these storms are getting stronger, and that intensity, that greater intensity, is related to the warming of the oceans. Now, there was this image in October that in my mind captured in a profound way two of the most prominent impacts, devastating impacts of climate change that we're seeing play out in the United States. This is an image of Hurricane Epsilon. We were well into late October. Normally the hurricane season would be over, but not this year. We continued well into the Greek alphabet. And this hurricane, this late season hurricane, you can see the satellite image, it's a visible image. And the brown fringe at the upper edge of that storm, right in here, that's the wildfire smoke from Colorado. So the record wildfires out west combining with a record hurricane season back east to produce images that capture these dual climate change impacts, these devastating dual climate change impacts. Now, again, the impacts are clear. It's hard to deny that climate change is real, but that hasn't stopped some fossil fuel interest front groups, those who advocate for them. It's what I've called the climate wars over several decades, this assault on the science of climate change by fossil fuel interests and those promoting them. And I wanted to play a clip from a congressional hearing I testified at a few years ago, back in 2017, when we were still really in the thick of what I would call the old climate war, when there was a concerted effort to try to discredit the science. And here we had the Republican chair of the House Science Committee, a conservative Republican from Texas, Lamar Smith, who was one of the largest recipients of fossil fuel money in the House of Representatives. He was a full-on climate change denier, By the way, he also had an undergraduate degree from one of our top Ivy League universities, Yale University, and he and I chatted about that before the hearing because we had both gotten degrees from Yale. He's a smart guy. He knows what he's saying is wrong. He knows that the science is solid, but as was once famously said by Upton Sinclair, it's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary, or say his campaign contributions, depend on him not understanding it. So Lamar Smith, the chair of the House Science Committee, held a hearing to try to call into question the very scientific foundation of climate change. He invited two climate change contrarians. Republicans were in control of the committee. Democrats were only allowed one witness. That was me. And I want to play one clip from this.
According to an article that came out a few days ago in the journal Science, Chairman Smith was on record at the Heartland Institute. This is a climate change denying Koch brothers funded outlet that has a climate change denier conference every year. And Chairman Smith spoke at that conference.
Dr. Mann, don't mischaracterize that.
Well, let me finish my.
No, they do not say that they are deniers, and you should not say that they are either.
Well, we can have that discussion. I'd be happy to. Let
me
finish
my statement. Be accurate in your description.
I stand by my statement. So can I finish my point?
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Yes. So he indicated at this conference that he, according to Science, and I'm quoting from them, he sees his role in this committee as a tool to advance his political agenda rather than a forum to examine important issues facing the U.S. research community. As a scientist, I find that deeply disturbing.
Dr. Mann, who said that?
This is according to Science Magazine, one of the most respected outlets when it comes to
And who are they
science.
quoting?
This is the author, Jeffrey Mervis, who wrote that article. I'd be happy to send to committee the article.
That is not known as an objective writer or magazine.
Well, it's Science Magazine.
Yeah, okay, so that's sort of the up is down, black is white world of climate change denial where, and I understand Nature and Science, there's a genuine debate as to which of those two journals are the most distinguished scientific journals in the world. But in this parallel universe of climate change denialism, apparently the leading scientific journals in the world, including the journal Science, are biased. Yeah, they're biased towards reality, and that's inconvenient, again, for climate change contrarians and climate change deniers. And that isn't limited to the United States. Here's a show. I appeared on Q&A. It's a national program, panel discussion program that operates under the Australian Broadcast Corporation. So it's very popular weekly program where people debate the issues of the day. And this was when I was in Australia about a year ago, just about a year ago today. And these epic bushfires were playing out. The devastation that was being caused by them was actually evident in Canberra, where I was doing this show, where they brought the panel to have this live show. And one of the other participants, Jim Molan, was a conservative senator who is a climate change contrarian. And I just want to play this clip as well.
You said you get information across your desk every day, which leads you to doubt or be open-minded about the science.
I am open-minded about it.
What is that information?
Oh, it's a range of information which goes. It's a range of. Thank you.
Sorry, we just respectfully listen to this.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this. What is the evidence that you are relying on?
I'm not relying on evidence, Hamish. I am saying.
You said it.
But this is why my mind is open. I would love to be convinced one way or the other, but to be prudent, what the government is doing is it's got a climate and emissions reduction policy, and it is a good policy, and it will mitigate risk to the maximum that it can. And where risk cannot be mitigated, it will adapt. And that's what we've got to work on is the adaptation.
Yeah, come on now, mate.
And he's an American.
Now, you should keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out.
Okay, and so that was sort of the highlight of that episode. That, of course, was a quote used previously by Carl Sagan. And I went on to, explain why, there really is a robust consensus about human-caused climate change. And there really isn't a credible case to be made against the science, though some politicians do continue to deny the reality and threat of climate change. They're increasingly in the minority. Now, I will mention one more example in the UK. I think you will all recognize this particular individual, the Lord Monckton, the third Viscount of Brenchley, Christopher Monckton, who is perhaps one of the most visible and prominent climate change deniers in the UK. In the past, when the IPCC put out a report talking about the impacts of climate change, and one of the impacts they talked was the rapidly disintegrating Himalayan glaciers, which are an important source of fresh water for a large part of Asia. The sort of the disappearance of mountain glaciers around the world is a crisis when it comes to, for example, fresh water supply. And it's one of the most marked impacts of climate change that we see playing out, the melting of ice. Now, Monckton has said in the past that, hey, the Himalayan glaciers are doing just fine. Well, some of you may have read this article that came out a week ago, or not even the article. You might have heard this story a little more than a week ago. The collapse of one of these glaciers in northern India led to an avalanche of flooding that killed hundreds of people. So the glaciers aren't doing just fine, and the people aren't doing just fine. This may be one of the most profound examples of where we can absolutely connect the dots. Those human fatalities were caused by climate change. They were caused by the collapse of this piece of this glacier that simply would not have happened in the absence of human-caused warming. So yes, climate change now is becoming increasingly deadly, and that toll can be measured literally in human lives. And denial, for that reason, largely past us, not completely past us. We've got a bout of cold weather in the United States and in Europe right now, although I think London has sort of recovered now from that cold snap. The Thames froze over for the first time in 60 years, generates headlines. Well, yeah, 60 years. So there was similar cold in the 1960s and 1970s. What we just lived through, what we just witnessed here in the United States and in the UK wasn't record cold. It was what we might call old-fashioned cold, the sort of cold that we used to see when I was growing up in the 1960s and 1970s. And that's important because we are seeing record heat. The heat extremes are getting hotter. The cold extremes are actually decreasing, but we still see now and then some of these old-fashioned, winter extreme weather events. And there is a healthy debate right now within the scientific community about the role that climate change might be playing. But if you go on social media today, you'll see, a member of the American Meteorological Society, former Environment Canada weather person, who is citing this Arctic cold air outbreak as if it's disproof of climate change. In reality, if anything, there might actually be a connection in that as we warm up the planet and we warm up the Arctic more than the rest of the planet because of the melting of ice. That is what we call positive feedback. It's an amplifying factor. And so the Arctic warms up faster than the rest of the planet. That decreases the difference between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes. And it's that difference that is responsible for the existence of the polar front, as we call it, the jet stream, and the polar vortex. So as we warm up the Arctic more than the rest of the planet, in general, we're slowing down the jet stream. We are reducing the strength of the polar vortex. And so that cold air is less likely to be bottled up near the Arctic. The polar vortex weakens, and so blobs of cold air more easily escape into mid-latitudes, like here in the US and in Europe and the UK right now. And what that means is that cold extremes might not be going away as quickly as we might expect on a warming planet. The warm extremes are increasing dramatically. The cold extremes are decreasing less dramatically. And that may be because of these connections. Climate change is actually leading to more extreme weather events that at times can give us those very cold air outbreaks like we're experiencing right now. So no, that doesn't disprove 2 centuries of basic physics and chemistry and the overwhelming evidence that the planet is warming up, and it's warming up because of the carbon pollution that we are producing. But that sort of denial, again, is largely behind us. We might see episodes of it when we get a winter cold air outbreak, and then that'll dissipate in a couple days, within a week. And by and large, politicians in the pay of the fossil fuel industry, fossil fuel front groups, their advocates, realize they can't credibly claim anymore that nothing is happening because we're seeing the impacts of climate change. They become so profound, so obvious. And so it's the thesis of my book that we've largely seen the end of the old climate war, the attempt by fossil fuel interests and those promoting them to discredit the science of climate change. And instead, we've seen the emergence of a whole new set of tactics because look, the fossil fuel industry, they're not going to roll over. They're not going to give up. You know, the most powerful industry on the face of the planet, they want to see us remain addicted to fossil fuels. And they don't care about the reason. So in essence, they don't care about the path we take. They just care about the destination, a destination of inaction and disengagement. And the way they're trying to encourage that now isn't so much by denying the science, but by denying that it's really a problem or arguing that there are better solutions, geoengineering, carbon capture and sequestration, other things besides reducing our carbon emissions as dramatically as we need to. Division, getting us fighting with each other, especially over lifestyle differences, choices, lifestyle preferences, getting people finger pointing at each other over their carbon purity. And just the other day, we saw a piece in The Guardian that attacked Bill Gates because he still flies on a private jet. I argue in the book that those sorts of finger pointing tactics aren't helpful. They tend to create division, and that's what the forces of inaction, what I call the inactivists, want. They want us divided so that we don't speak, with a unified voice demanding change. And one excellent way of doing that is to get us pointing fingers at each other and talking about our own individual carbon footprint rather than their carbon footprint. And we see a lot of that today. We see this framing where it's all about individual behavior, a deflection from the needed systemic solutions, prices on carbon, incentives for renewable energy, removing subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure. They don't want us focused on those systemic changes. They want to make it all about us, as if we as individuals are entirely responsible for the problem and the solution falls entirely on us. And so let me go through these sorts of new fronts in the new climate war. Soft denial, not denying the science of climate change, but denying that it's really a problem or that getting off fossil fuels is the solution. And we see people like Bjorn Lomborg, the so-called skeptical environmentalist, who is arguably neither. Skepticism is a good thing in science, but it has to be applied uniformly, not just in the form of denouncing overwhelmingly established science for ideological or political reasons. That's not skepticism, that's contrarianism and denial. And Bjorn Lomborg is very effective at promoting that sort of soft denial. He had a book, came out last year. Again, you can just see the title, False Alarm, There's No Problem Here. He claims to be an economist, although I don't believe that he has more than 1 or 2 actual peer-reviewed articles in the literature. Meanwhile, the New York Times got a Nobel Prize-winning economist to review his book, Joseph Stiglitz, and I'll just read the final paragraph of Stiglitz's review of False Alarm. This book proves the aphorism that a little knowledge is dangerous. It's nominally about air pollution. It's really about mind pollution. Well said, Joseph Stiglitz. And there are others who have adopted that shtick. And it sells, you know, and it generates a lot of headlines. And it's typically the conservative media like the Australian or Fox News in the US or the Murdoch tabloids in the UK that promote this message. So people like Lundberg and Schellenberger provide the material, and then the conservative media and the fossil fuel sort of denial delay machine promote it. And it leads to confusion on the part of the public. Delay. Again, there's a recognition, I think, now by the fossil fuel industry that we're already undergoing this transition. We are going to leave fossil fuels behind. The age of fossil fuels is coming to an end. But they want to slow that transition down as much as possible because they continue to make billions of dollar profits. Every year we remain addicted to fossil fuels. So at this point, it's about delaying action through any arguments they can come up with. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, as Australia was dealing with these unprecedented climate change wrought disasters, the bushfires during the Black Summer, Morrison was continuing to deny that we really need to do anything about climate change. In fact, he's argued for a natural gas-driven recovery from the pandemic, and he refuses to support any actual policy measures, for example, that would price carbon, put a price on carbon, or provide incentives for renewable energy. Republicans in the US like Marco Rubio, who comes from Florida, where the people of that state are literally on the front lines. They're now seeing the flooding of Miami and Fort Lauderdale in southern Florida through a combination of sea level rise and more intense hurricanes that are fundamentally threatening their coastline and all the people who live along those coastlines. But Marco Rubio says we should just adapt. I guess those people living on the coast need to grow gills and fins, because that's really the only way we could adapt to these impacts as they continue to play out. And there will need to be some amount of adaptation to the impacts that are baked in that we can no longer avoid. But we obviously have to mitigate whatever climate change we still can through dramatic action. And people like Marco Rubio, Republicans, know that they can't credibly deny climate change is happening. They even have to sound like they're in support of some sort of solution, but it's typically a fake solution, like let's just adapt, or let's just allow market innovation to solve the problem on its own, as if that's worked. We see the promotion of geoengineering. And look, there's a reasonable conversation to be had, a scientific conversation to be had in particular, if nothing else, by using models to look at some of these schemes, like shooting sulfate particles into the stratosphere to block out some of the sunlight to try to offset the warming effect of greenhouse gases. This is one example of sort of a massive planetary intervention that has been proposed by some advocates. And scientists have been researching using climate models to see what, how that might actually play out. And if anything, the scientific research that's been done demonstrates why this would be a really bad idea. We could end up far worse off than if we had not engaged in these massive additional interventions, manipulations of our global environment, of a system, our planet that we don't understand perfectly. The law of unintended consequences reigns supreme. But it is a convenient sort of talking point for some who want to sort of kick the can down the road. Hey, we'll get off carbon, but we don't have to worry too much because we will have these stopgap solutions like geoengineering if we really run into trouble. Holding that out as an ultimate solution takes pressure off polluters to reduce carbon emissions now. So that's a delay measure as well. Deflection, I talked a little bit about that. And let me talk about the infamous crying Indian commercial of the early 1970s when I was growing up in the United States. Indian, of course, isn't the correct terminology. We're talking about Native Americans. And Native American culture was sort of part of the zeitgeist of the early 1970s. There was sort of a mythology about our the native people of our country, and sort of they had almost a spiritual role, the way that they were tied to our environment. And so any commercial that tapped into that really was tapping into the powerfulness of Native American culture and folklore and imagery at that time. And I talk about that in my book. As I was growing up, this commercial had a profound impact on me. And it shows this Native American, although I should say he wasn't actually a Native American, he was an Italian American. The actor's name was Iron Eyes Cody, Italian American, who played a Native American in movies and in this commercial. That was actually the least of the subterfuge that was behind this particular advertising campaign, because while it was billed sort of as an effort to engage us, the tagline was, "People start pollution, people can stop it." Look, all of this bottle and can litter that's building up on our countryside and leading to this tear running down the face of Iron Eyes Cody as the voiceover comes in. That's due to you and me just not being good citizens, not taking care of our environment. And it felt like it was very empowering of a whole generation. Yeah, we have to really clean up the environment. We can do this. But we had all been had. Even some environmental groups who had initially supported this campaign had co-produced and supported this advertising campaign, realized within a year or so that that we had all been had. This was actually a PR campaign hatched on Madison Avenue by Coca-Cola and the beverage industry. They didn't want to see bottle bills in the pass in the various states, like Massachusetts, where I grew up, and I talk about how it played out in Massachusetts. These would be bills that would require bottles and cans to have a deposit on them, and they could be returned to get that deposit back by consumers. It would get rid of the bottle and can litter, but it would hurt the bottom line of the beverage industry because they would have to pay for the processing of those bottles and those returned bottles and cans, and they don't want to do that. So instead, they engaged in a millions of dollars disinformation campaign aimed at convincing us that we were the solution. We didn't need systemic solutions. We didn't need policies. It was about you and me just being better citizens. Thanks to the Crying Indian campaign, we have one of our two other profound global environmental problems that plagues us today, the global plastic pollution crisis. We can thank the beverage industry and this deflection campaign for that environmental crisis. Well, the fossil fuel industry is using that same playbook today. And I'll be blunt, British Petroleum actually came up with the concept of an individual carbon footprint calculator. In fact, they offered one of the first individual carbon footprint calculators in the early 2000s. Because look, the fossil fuel industry doesn't want us looking at their carbon footprint. The overwhelming carbon footprint is with the polluters. 70% of the carbon pollution coming from just a handful of major fossil fuel companies. They don't want us looking at their carbon footprint. They want us focusing on our own carbon footprint. And that sort of framing through what is sometimes known as seepage, which is to say they put out this sort of rhetoric, and even objective news sources, media outlets like the New York Times internalize that. And the New York Times is engaged in sort of massive promotion of the frame that climate solutions are all about individual behavior, our travel, our travel plans, our diets, how many children we have. They want to make it all about us. And hey, if they can get us finger pointing at each other and divide us in the process of doing that, then it's a twofer. And hey, if they can discredit some prominent climate advocates by using this focus on individual behavior to discredit them as hypocrites, well, then it's a threefer. And indeed, they've done that. They've tried to distract us, to deflect the conversation towards, individual behavior so that we don't have the needed conversation about systemic solutions. And look, we need both. We should all be the best stewards of the environment we can be, and we should all do everything we can to reduce our individual environmental and carbon footprint. In many cases, this saves us money, it makes us healthier, it sets a good example for other people. We should do those things, but what we can't allow is for the inactivists, the fossil fuel interests, and those promoting their agenda to convince us that that's the entire solution. We don't need a price on carbon. We don't need subsidies for renewable energy. And it's, as I said, a great way to divide us. If you can go after Al Gore and Leo DiCaprio, two of our more prominent voices here in the United States when it comes to climate advocacy, by pointing to their supposed lifestyle choices as, indicating that they're a hypocrite and we shouldn't be listening to what they have to say. And of course, none of these people are arguing that we all have to live off the grid. What they're arguing is that we need to work within the system that exists to change the incentives so that we all collectively move in the direction that we need to go. And most recently, this has been used by the Murdoch press in the form of Fox News, for example, to try to discredit the United States' new special envoy on climate appointed by Joe Biden, who has, in his first month as president, executed a very bold plan on climate. And he's appointed John Kerry, who is sort of one of the leading figures when it comes to international diplomacy on climate, played a very important role in the Paris Accord, played an important role in the bilateral agreement between China and the US under the Obama administration that laid the groundwork for the Paris Agreement. So, hey, if you can discredit him by, focusing on the fact that, yeah, he still flies around to do the business that he needs to do, again, it's a threefer. It deflects attention away from systemic solutions to individual behavior. It divides the community. It's a divide and conquer way of defeating the environmental advocacy community. And it renders or attempts to render some of our thought leaders and opinion leaders as hypocrites that we shouldn't listen to because they don't walk the walk, supposedly. And the division also created by figures who we might think of as being on the progressive side of the spectrum. Michael Moore, this progressive icon whose most recent film, The Planet of the Humans, was a full-on assault on renewable energy, which is the most viable path forward in decarbonizing human civilization. And here, somebody well known for his advocacy on the left side of our spectrum, a liberal icon, makes this movie attacking renewable energy. Now, I don't know what was behind Michael Moore's, what his intent was. He hasn't really had any successes in the last 10 years, and maybe the sort of unanticipated, surprising sort of man bites dog story of a liberal icon coming out against renewable energy, maybe he thought that would, get him a lot of attention for this latest effort. I don't know what his reasons were. What I can tell you is who was promoting his film. And it was the usual suspects. It was all the Koch brothers front groups, the Murdoch press, right-wing, media outlets like Breitbart News. They loved this film and they did everything they could to promote it. And it's a great way, once again, to divide the climate advocacy community by at least convincing some of them using a liberal icon within the, progressive movement to argue that, hey, renewable energy isn't the solution, and to divide climate advocates on that matter. And there are many other examples of this. And then finally, Doomism. And I'm running towards the end of my 45 minutes here. Suffice it to say that climate doom porn, which I call it, has become very widespread. It's very successful. These stories about how, climate change is unstoppable and we're going to see this infernal cascade of impacts and there's nothing we can do about it. That's very dramatic. It makes for very dramatic prose. It makes for books that sell extremely well, magazines that sell extremely well, news articles that get lots and lots of clicks. But it's typically premised on anti-science, on bad science. It's as bad as the science that climate change deniers use. For example, the claim that we've already committed to enough warming that all of the methane from the Arctic is going to be released into the atmosphere and it's going to lead to runaway warming. There's not a shred of actual scientific evidence for that, but this sort of methane bomb narrative is behind most of these doomist tones and most of these doomist narratives. And again, the forces of inaction don't care about the path you take. They just care about the destination. They want you disengaged. And if you're disengaged because you don't accept the science, or you're disengaged because it seems like there's nothing we can do about it anymore, it leads you down that same path of inaction. And it's not surprising that the inactivists have actually been throwing fuel in the fire of doomism and doom mongering. So finally, in the few minutes that I have here, winning the new climate war, it's about urgency and agency. Clearly, there's urgency. We have to bring our carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within the next decade if there's any chance of holding warming below a truly dangerous 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we need dramatic action, but there is agency. We can still take action. We're not committed to runaway warming. We can still prevent the worst impacts of climate change. And the solution, sorry, Bill Gates, and I know my good friend Bob Ward reviewed both of our books recently for The Guardian, for The Observer, the Sunday Guardian, and you should check out, it's a great article. And I have to say, I do think it's great that Bill Gates is using his platform to raise awareness about the climate threat. I differ with Gates on some specifics. In the past, he said we need a technological miracle. And the evidence to me proves otherwise. We don't need a miracle. We've already got it in the form of wind, solar, geothermal. It's a matter of having the political will to scale up those technologies dramatically and to scale down fossil fuel burning as quickly as possible. And we do need to have a difficult debate, policy debate about how we do that. And Gates makes the argument for the role that nuclear energy might play. I personally, in the book, argue that it's probably not part of an optimal path forward, but let's have that debate. That's a worthy debate. Is climate change a crisis? That's not a worthy debate. Is it leading to dramatic impacts? That's not a worthy debate. We can see that that's the case. Can we still do something about it? Again, that's not a worthy debate. We clearly can. The question is what? And let's have that conversation. And we've seen carbon emissions flatten out. They started to come down in the electricity division 2 years ago. This year, they came down 7%. A lot of that was due to the COVID-19 lockdown policies. But what it indicates is we are starting to round that corner. We're starting to bring those carbon emissions down. Now we have to go well beyond that. We got a 7% reduction this last year. That's great, but we need to do at least that much every year for the next 10 years. And that means the sort of social distancing and lockdown policies that are probably going to dissipate somewhat as we sort of get past the pandemic. Even all of that change alone in our behavior wasn't enough because we need systemic change. We need policies that decarbonize our economy. And I'm optimistic that we'll do it. And in the book, I explain why. We're seeing dramatic inroads, renewable energy. We're seeing carbon emissions flatten and start to come down. We just need to accelerate a change that's already underway. The youth climate movement has really recentered this, this conversation where it needs to be about our moral obligation to act before it's too late to preserve this planet for future generations. And with the new Biden administration, there's a real possibility now for meaningful action by the United States. And when the United States leads, what we've seen is the rest of the world comes along. This is a reason for cautious optimism. Our book went to press in August, but I anticipated that this is where we would be now. And it is where we are. We're seeing bold action. We've got a Democratic Congress that can actually bring climate legislation to the Senate floor and vote on it. And I think we're going to see meaningful climate legislation to complement the bold executive agenda that we're seeing from the current president, and that new leadership is really going to help bring along other intransigent actors, for example, like Australia. And once again, the youth climate movement, Greta Thunberg in the United States, Alexandra Vilsenor, who's played a similar role raising awareness about the climate crisis and recentering it as our ethical obligation not to destroy this planet for the people who had the least role in creating this problem in the first place. And whether that's the developing world versus the industrial world, or people who are alive now versus people who will adopt this planet in future decades. It is our ethical obligation to act before it's too late, and there is still time to act. And so I will leave it there, and I look forward to our question and answers. And I will get out of the share mode here. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Mike. Really good stuff. And I appreciate how difficult it is in the space of just 45 minutes to kind of cover all the ground in the book. And I hope everyone will see that the book is very rich, and I hope everybody goes and buys a copy now to go into more detail, all the issues you've covered there.
Thanks, Bob.
I'm gonna ask the audience again, if you want to ask a question of Mike, put it in the Q&A, vote for your favorite ones. We'll come to the question shortly, but I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative to begin with by asking my own question. So you obviously wrote the book before the outcome was known of the presidential election was known. And although you anticipated the outcome, I was going to ask you to perhaps reflect on Donald Trump's legacy in terms of the prevalence of attitudes in the United States. One might hope, for instance, that Trump, who described climate change famously as a hoax, because of the way in which he's left office and is now the only president to have been impeached twice, that he had discredited all the views that went with him, including his denial of climate change. But unfortunately, we've seen in the past few weeks, Ted Cruz and Rand Paul both make stupid statements about climate change. So I don't know what you're feeling. Has Trump left the White House with denial being less credible, more credible, or made no difference?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bob. It's an important one. Ted Cruz, of course, has a Princeton undergraduate degree, was a championship debater in college. He's too smart to believe what he's saying. And so once again, it's about the cynicism that still exists within, a number of prominent politicians in the Republican Party. But the reason I'm optimistic is that there are probably a dozen or so Republicans who are sort of in the closet on climate, which is to say they haven't really come out publicly, but based on conversations with folks, their staffers, people who know them, they would support climate action. They recognize that the problem is real. They don't want to be on the wrong side of history. They're just worried that it's dangerous for them to come out right now in this very fraught environment post-Trump. And we've seen that just in this impeachment vote where, there's an estimate that there probably would have been 70 votes to actually convict Donald Trump in the Senate if it was a secret vote. But they're all worried because Donald Trump's ground forces, the sort of rabble that he has turned out, are, as we've seen, are willing to use some of the most vile tactics, violence and murder to intimidate people who don't stand with their dear leader, Donald Trump. And so we did inherit this extremely caustic political environment. Some people would argue that this was just sort of the culmination of a trend that had been underway for some decades within the Republican Party as they moved away sort of from, well, certainly science-based sort of policy towards increasing ideologically based policy. And of course, the Republican Party has largely become an advocate for the fossil fuel industry and for efforts to discredit this, if not discredit the science, at least block meaningful action. So where do we stand now? I think that we have to wait and see because there are these sort of dueling influences. There's still the residual, of Trumpism, but we also saw the way that he went out. And the way that he went out is that he failed us when it comes to the greatest crisis we've ever faced. And the failure was due to his ideological opposition to science, to public health science that told us we needed to engage in social distancing measures and mask wearing. And that behavior was inconvenient to him being reelected. And it was inconvenient to the vested interests who wanted him reelected, which includes the fossil fuel industry. And that's why it became a deeply partisan issue, whether we should even listen to our top public health official, Anthony Fauci. I wrote a piece for Newsweek last year, the title of which was Anthony Fauci, We Feel Your Pain. Because those of us in the climate world have been facing this for decades, ideologically based attacks on our science and on us individually, and threats against us individually because of the inconvenient nature of the message. So my thinking is that, yes, you have this sort of weaponized core of Trump supporters who will be adversarial to any of the policies that Trump opposes, and that includes climate. But at the same time, the way he went out, I think, has opened the eyes of a lot of people sort of in the middle to the dangers, the deadliness, literally the deadliness of anti-science. When we refuse to listen to the word of science, we can measure that toll in the United States now in terms of hundreds of thousands of human lives that were lost. People who have neighbors, friends, family members whose lives were lost because we failed to heed the word of science. It's not going to win over that sort of fringe core 25% or so who, supported the storming of the Capitol, think that the election was stolen, et cetera. But I think people who were sort of in the middle are going to be moved now into the category of, now willing to embrace the lessons that we learn from science. And that obviously translates to the climate crisis, right? Because we will largely be past this pandemic, a year from now. It'll largely be in our rearview mirror, but an even greater crisis will still loom. That's the climate crisis. And my hope is that, as tragic as this, episode in our history was, that it might actually create an opportunity for a more meaningful conversation about attacking this even greater crisis. And the fact that we have some real leadership now in doing so gives me the cautious optimism that I had when I wrote the book. It's sort of been borne out by the events that have unfolded since then. I'm not a Nostradamus, but you could get a sense of where the political winds seem to be blowing, even last summer. And they've moved us into a more favorable environment. And to the extent that they've moved the United States into a more favorable environment, that creates a more favorable environment globally.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Mike. And just to the audience, I recommend that you also read, if you haven't, Mike's previous book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, where you'll get a full account of all the things that Mike has had to put up with through his career with the politically motivated attacks on him. And you understand that he really knows what he's talking about. Okay.
There's so many attacks, I barely even notice them anymore.
Yeah. Okay. We've got just over half an hour, so I'm going to go now to the Q&A from the audience, and we're going to go through in the order in which they have been prioritized by the audience themselves. So
I'll try to keep my answers shorter because I want to get through as many of these as I can.
Very, very good. Okay, let's go through as many as we can. Okay, so the first one is from James Malone. Mike, what is your view on net zero commitments by corporates? Are these voluntary commitments by companies another form of deflection and delay tactics to prevent carbon pricing policies and systematic action?
Yeah, thanks, James. It's a great question. No, I think there's some real good faith there. I mean, invariably you do have, businesses, corporations, companies who engage in greenwash. They know they have to at least say the right thing, but when it comes to putting their money where their mouth is, they're not really willing to take the initiative necessary to implement, the policies they're arguing for. But you do see some of our largest companies, Apple is a good example, Google, others in the United States, that are working very hard, for example, to decarbonize their operations, their data centers. The supply chain is sort of the biggest challenge. That's the hardest part, to decarbonize your supply chain, because you're then relying on other businesses, other companies. But you see investment firms now, the finance industry, really talking seriously. Blackstone, the Bank of England, Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, really making some pretty, I would say, strident statements about the need to stop financing additional fossil fuel infrastructure. When I was down in Australia, I had a number of meetings with leading what are known as super funds, superannuation funds in Australia. Employers have to invest a certain amount of their employees' money in these funds, these retirement funds, superannuation funds, and they do see themselves as bound by fiduciary responsibility. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their client, and they are interpreting that broadly. That responsibility means not destroying the planet for their client and for their client's children and grandchildren. And I think a number of them really do see their remit quite broadly when it comes to their fiduciary responsibility. Enough people in upper level management of these companies that I think it's real. But look, yeah, we obviously need policies in addition that incentivize that. We can't just rely on the goodwill of individuals or industry to do what's right. We need market incentives as well. We need every tool in the toolbox.
Very good. Excellent. Next up, Brian McHugh. What are your hopes for COP26 in Glasgow this year?
Thanks, Brian. It's a good question. You know, what I hope is that we don't wait to Glasgow to make the progress that we need to make. I hope that the various participating countries make quite a bit of progress before then. So, by the time that the COP comes together in Glasgow at the end of the year, we will already have a meaningful ratcheting up of the various commitments of all the countries, including now the United States again, which is back in Paris. One of the first acts on the part of this administration was rejoin the Paris Agreement after Trump had become the only country in the world to pull out of it. But look, the Paris commitments alone, as Bob and others know, there are a number of organizations that do a great job in sort of keeping track of those, and which countries are meeting them and which aren't. We've got to go well beyond the current commitments. We've got to ratchet up those commitments if there's going to be any possibility of averting 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And so that means that by the time Glasgow comes along, November, December this year, we already have to have commitments from all the countries in place that represent a meaningful ratcheting up from the current commitments that do actually get us on the path to limiting warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. One of the things that encourages me is Joe Biden holding this international forum. You can think of it as almost an interim COP, where it's bringing together world leaders on Earth Day, April 22nd, in this country to meet and talk about what we need to do to confront this crisis. And I think because of that, there will be enough progress made in the first few months of this year that by the time we make it to COP, the discussion's already pretty much over, and that we have, everybody is on paper, is on record as ratcheting up their commitments and agreeing to something that will have even more teeth in it. That's my hope, and that's my expectation, again, because of the renewed leadership we have on the part of the United States.
Indeed, it's very good to see the United States become, in fact, this week will officially become a party again to the Paris Agreement. Right. It's good to have the US back on the international stage. So next up, we have a question from Alison Green, who is Executive Director of Scientists Warning Foundation. And Alison asks, one could argue that the policymaking process on climate change has failed because emissions have continued to rise in spite of the best efforts of people like you or scientists like you, Mike. If the policymaking process has been failing, what do you think needs to change in order to bring about the radical shifts we now need to see?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, thanks. That's a great question. And, it's I guess I would sort of gently challenge the premise of the question. I think there has been a lot of progress, even in some of the charts that I showed towards the end of my presentation, where global carbon emissions have now come to a peak. For several years, they didn't go up in any appreciable way. And so we're sort of at the top of the mountain. That's the good news. bad news is we got to get down the side of the mountain. We've got to go well beyond just bringing them to a peak. We've got to bring those carbon emissions to net zero and fairly quickly within a matter of decades. And so I actually think that we can see in the numbers, if you look at the, the International Energy IEA association, you look at the sort of global numbers, we can actually see, and they showed in the 2019, the numbers flatlined, but carbon emissions in the in the electricity sector, power generation sector came down, and they were able to attribute that specifically to the inroads in renewable energy, the decarbonization of those sectors, of the energy sector, the electricity sector. So we can actually see that the policies that are in place are making a difference. The problem is those aren't enough, as we've said, even the Paris commitments, and we're going to come close. The United States, Europe, most of the countries are going to come close to their Paris commitments. That's, again, good news. Bad news is that the current Paris commitments aren't enough. We've got to go beyond that. So I think we have to see the glass as half full, not half empty, and recognize that we're making progress, but we've got to make a lot more progress, and recognize the moment we're in. This is the most opportune moment we have had yet, where all of these factors have come together, as I argue in the book. The impacts of climate change. We now understand that this is a crisis because we see it playing out in real time. The recentering of this conversation by the youth climate movement as an issue ultimately of our ethical obligation to not destroy this planet. The fact that we actually learned some hard-won lessons from the pandemic that maybe will help inform this conversation about an even greater crisis that we face. I think all that comes together with this favorable shift now in the political winds here in the United States, with implications for the global politics of this issue. All that comes together now to create the most opportune moment we've had. This is our time, as I say, and let's take advantage of it.
Very good. Yes, I think it is a form of denial sometimes when people say, oh, what's the point? Nobody's doing anything. And I know politicians get fed up with hearing that, because it means that those who are making an effort are not having their efforts recognized. But it's clear we do need to do more. And as you say, Mike,
was that Allison? Was the name of the?
Yeah, Allison. Yeah.
Yeah, and Allison, I think I know Allison from social media. I'm pretty sure I recognize the name.
Very good.
And I know that, that these are legitimate concerns that people have, and it's important for us to address them. And I'm glad that she asked that question.
Very good. So next up, Livia Rossi, who describes herself as an alumni of LSE's MSc course in Environmental Policy and Regulation. Olivia asks, do you think the reliance of carbon-intensive sectors on yet to be commercialized technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, is another form of delaying policy response that support available technologies capable of driving structural change? So, is that a form of delay?
Oh, and that was who was the question was from?
Livia Rossi.
Okay, well, thanks, Olivia. That's a great question as well, and. There is in the answer, the answer to it is a bit nuanced. What I do think we need to do, there are certain very difficult to decarbonize sectors like, steel manufacturing, cement production, and aviation. And in those difficult to decarbonize sectors, so they're not part of the low-hanging fruit. In most of the rest of the sectors of our economy, we have the tools necessary now to reduce carbon emissions dramatically. But there are a few sectors that don't add up to all that much. I mean, maybe we're talking 10, 15% of emissions. So if we could decarbonize everything else, we would be in good shape. But we also should work in decarbonizing those difficult to decarbonize sectors. And that might involve, in those cases, things like carbon capture and sequestration, where that really might be the only option in when it comes to, for example, cement manufacturing, iron production, aviation. To some extent, we might have to rely on things like verifiable offsets while we work towards technology. And I think it's great that our friend Richard Branson, who I've gotten to know over the years, has put his, time and has used his platform to really try to crack that difficult nut, and providing lots of funding for research into how we can decarbonize aviation, because we're not there yet. And it's only about 7% of our carbon emissions total. Or actually, no, it's like 3%, arguably 7% if you include indirect effects like contrails from the clouds that are formed from aviation. But it's a small part, but it would be nice to decarbonize that sector as well. And that's where, I will agree with people like, Bill Gates. We do need additional research and development to decarbonize some of these sectors, but we have the technology to decarbonize most of our economy now. And let's do what we can now and not wait for, the perfect, which could be the enemy of the good here.
Excellent. Okay, next we have a question from Friederike Hartz, who's a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. And Friederike writes, I am interested in the role of scientists in this new climate war. Can climate scientists still produce value-free or neutral science, and she says, see Miltonian norms of science, while being part of engaging in this war, or are they at risk of becoming activists?
Thanks so much. That was the name
Friederike,
again.
Friederike Hartz.
Yeah, well, thanks, Friederike. It's a great question, and yeah, I think I've heard that school, Cambridge. Yeah, it's an okay college. No, some of our great scientific thinkers, of course, came from Cambridge, and so when we talk about science, of course, there's a great legacy at Cambridge University, and it's become a real challenge. It's what my good friend, who's no longer with us, one of the great science communicators, of the modern era, Steve Schneider, used to refer to as the double ethical bind that we find ourselves in. When you're doing science, the findings of which have deep implications for the welfare of society, yes, you have to be true to your oath, for the science that you do to be objective. It shouldn't be tainted or colored by your policy opinions, by your views, by your values. It should stand on its own. But the science that you do can ultimately impact how you frame the implications of that science. And so your politics, your values shouldn't influence, the way you do a regression analysis, the processes you put into your models. We want that to be as objective as possible. But certainly, like any citizen, scientists have the right to want to talk about and communicate the risks that we face. And in the case of climate change, obviously, our assessment of those risks is informed by the science that we do. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that's now 7 years old called "If You See Something, Say Something." And it's borrowed, a motto borrowed from our Department of Homeland Security. But I argue that as scientists, funded by the taxpayers, we have an obligation, we see a risk, and we should be communicating that risk to the public. It's an obligation on our part collectively. It doesn't mean all scientists need to be science communicators. Some scientists are, best left in their laboratories doing what they love doing science. But there should be sort of a group of scientists who place value and put effort into communicating the implications, the science and its implications. And in the end, we all have to sort of decide where that dividing line is. I myself resist the temptation to be overly policy prescriptive, which is to say, I'm not going to tell you that, I can say that I think we need a price on carbon as one of the key demand side measures that help level the playing field. And there's solid economic arguments. And I've tried to inform myself about the economics and the political science and all the other facets of this problem. What I don't feel comfortable in doing is saying, and so we need a revenue neutral carbon tax that is constructed in this way. When it starts getting into those finer details, that's for our politicians to debate, as long as that debate is in good faith and is premised on an objective assessment of what the risks are, what the costs are. And I view my role as a scientist to inform that conversation, but to not try to prescribe the specific form of the solutions. And in my book, in The New Climate War, I point out that there are all these tools in the toolbox, and there are demand side measures and supply side measures, and we're probably going to need all the tools available to us. Let's have that conversation about how we design those tools and how we deploy them. That's for our policymakers to debate, as long as it is an objective effort on their part to act on our behalf.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Mike. Now we have a question from Rafaela Rosa, who is a federal judge in Brazil. We're spreading the net very wide this evening. So welcome, Rafaela. And Rafaela writes, what do you believe is the greatest contribution that judicial systems, including court decisions, can provide in the urgency of promoting decarbonisation? For example, is it forcing carbon majors to decarbonise their businesses, changing their line of businesses? Could this be an alternative to current policy making? So
yeah,
that's
thanks,
from
Rafaela
Rosa. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Rafaela. It's another great question. All these questions have been great questions, and we could have a half-hour conversation about each of them, so we can never do justice to these big and important questions. But yeah, I do think here, of course, my thinking is framed largely by sort of our legal system here in the United States, but a lot of these principles generalize to other systems of jurisprudence that are often in some way based on the same sort of English common law of centuries ago. The idea, for example, that courts have a right to bar the deliberate deception of the citizenry. I think that's a long-standing sort of principle of jurisprudence. In the United States, there's actually a specific section of the law, RICO, that has to do with racketeering charges, basically companies that defrauded their shareholders by lying to them about the practices of the company. And we saw, for example, that the tobacco industry was successfully brought to justice for hiding the health impact of their product. They knew back in the 1950s that their product, cigarettes, tobacco products, were killing people, lung cancer, other health ailments, and they chose to hide that. That might sound a little familiar. I think we've heard that story again, haven't we? I'll come back to that because it has great relevance to the industry, the industry-funded climate change denial campaign. But the tobacco industry, through their deception, deceived their shareholders. They defrauded the public. They hid the negative impacts of their product from all of them. And they were successfully sued by a group of states' attorneys general. It was ultimately settled for a very large amount. And as part of the settlement, they were forced to turn over all their internal documents which scientists and experts, like my good friend Naomi Oreskes and others, have been able to dive into and see just how they were doing that, how they were hiding what they knew, the threats that they knew existed of their product. Some of the same attorneys who successfully argued that case have come out and said, we see the fossil fuel industry funded climate change denial campaign as very analogous to what the tobacco industry did. And the same RICO statutes that were used against tobacco apply here potentially against fossil fuel interests. And so we've seen a number of lawsuits play out. Some of them have been shelved, have been blocked by the courts. Others continue to be on appeal and are moving forward. But in the United States, we have three branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And right now we've got an executive branch, the Biden administration, that's doing everything they can to act on climate. We've got a legislative branch that's now controlled by Democrats who have indicated that they will accomplish climate legislation, even if they have to do it on a purely partisan level through a process known as reconciliation, where it's just the 50 Democrats and the tie-breaking vote from the Democratic vice president. That's enough to pass climate legislation through reconciliation. So we've got executive action, we've got legislative action, and the third branch is, of course, the judicial branch. And I think we're going to see some important decisions from the judicial branch in the next years when it comes to the climate crisis, and in particular, the deceptive practices that were used by the fossil fuel industry to hide the impacts of their product from the public. I do think there will be ramifications for that.
Very good, Mike. Good. We've got about just under 10 minutes left, so we'll try and get through as many of these questions now as we can. So the next question is from Heidi Zamzow, who's describes herself as a former oceanographer and a current LSE PhD student in psychological and behavioral science. And Heidi asks, corporate influence aside, individuals as citizens elect leaders and policymakers, and individuals as consumers drive market demand. Do you see a role here for individuals? And if so, how do we mobilize individuals as citizens and consumers without deflecting responsibility from government? Policymakers will not act unless they feel they have a public mandate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Heidi. A great question. And by the way, once an oceanographer, always an oceanographer. You'll never look at ocean currents the same way again, right? So, so more power to you. Thanks for contributing to the science, and thanks for a great question. Yeah, I try to be very clear about that in the book. After all, what is collective action but a collection of individuals demanding action? And so to the extent that policy change is driven by collective action on our part, demanding change by policymakers, voting for politicians who are willing to do something about the problem, voting out those politicians who aren't, and using every other means available to us, using our voice to make sure that it's part of the larger conversation on social media, at school, in the workplace. There are so many things that we can do as individuals aside from changing our own practices that contribute to the larger conversation and that put pressure on our policymakers. And so absolutely, that individual action is essential. And I see it as, fundamental to when I talk about collective action and policy change. What I mean by collective action is individuals everywhere working together to demand accountability on the part of the politicians and to affect the changes that we need to see.
Very good. Okay. Next up, Mark Pettigrew, who is Professor of Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Professor Pettigrew asks, in your book, you describe the common tactics used by climate change deniers and the fossil fuel industry, and indeed the tobacco industry, amongst others. These are the same misinformation strategies used by other harmful industries, including the alcohol industry and the gambling industry, among many others. And often the dark money behind the misinformation is from the same source. So, Professor Pettigrew's question is there scope for researchers working across these areas to collaborate more when combating misinformation? And if so, how do they do this?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a great one. That was Alex?
Mark Pettigrew.
Yeah, Mark. So that actually is happening in the sort of social science literature. You see people, who have worked, for example, in public health, now sort of applying a lot of what was learned, the tools that were learned, the lessons that were learned in the realm, for example, of climate, the climate crisis. My good friend Ed Maybach at George Mason University, who is part of the Yale George Mason operation. They've done a lot of really important polling on climate and public opinion assessment, and also a lot of sort of documentation as to what sort of approaches worked in the past in these other areas. So Ed, comes out of the public health profession, and he brought all those tools and that knowledge from public health into the climate realm. And so there is that sort of interdisciplinary interaction taking place today. And it's part of why I do think that we have a much more informed conversation, because our colleagues in these other areas, have really helped inform the framing of the climate crisis. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We see that the forces of disinformation have, of course, borrowed from their own legacy of campaign tactics and approaches. We saw how, the tobacco industry, their efforts, and the beverage industry's efforts were adopted by the fossil fuel industry. So they're all collaborating. We would be foolish if those of us who are advocating for science for the public good weren't also collaborating. And to a large extent, I think that is happening now.
Very good. Okay, we've got time for one more question with a quick answer. And it's not an easy question, it has to be said. So from Paris Singh, who's a student at King's College London. How should uncertainty be communicated to the masses? Often, reading about uncertainties in climate models leads to people not taking action because they think the results of the models are not certain. So why bother? So it's a big question, but we've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, so the short answer: how should scientists communicate uncertainty? Well, they should do it well. But now I can provide a somewhat more layered response, and if we don't get past that, at least we've got that. Uncertainty is a reason for greater action, and there are scientists and experts. My friend Gurno Wagner, for example, who co-authored a book, the Heavy Tail, the Long Tail, I forget what the title was now, but economists who have sort of looked at what the true impact of uncertainty is. And what they've shown is that if you do a proper accounting of uncertainty and how it translates in a sort of in a cost-benefit analysis and in a sort of risk assessment, it turns out that uncertainty is a reason for taking even greater action because of the possibility of those uncertainties cutting against us. And we've seen that with ice sheet collapse, sea level rise, extreme weather events. In many of these cases, we're actually seeing impacts that are greater than what our models predicted just a decade ago. So uncertainty is cutting against us. And if anything, it's a reason for more concerted action. And there are a group of experts now who have really tried to reclaim the rightful role of uncertainty in this conversation, because it's hardly the justification for inaction that the critics would like you to think it is. Uncertainty, it properly communicated, is a reason for even greater action. So there's the fuller answer, but we could talk for 30 minutes about that alone. It's a really important question, and it's one that we have to continue to confront. How can we explain both the things we know and the things we don't know in a way that properly informs the public assessment of risk?
Excellent. Very good. And that's a brilliant end to what has been a brilliant session. So thank you indeed, Mike, for your lecture and for dealing so comprehensively with all the questions. I know it's a lot to get through, and you've done very well. It might feel like a marathon, a 90-minute session like this. So
I've got another 90-minute session coming up.
Another 90 minutes. Okay. Well, at least you're warmed up now. So very good. I want to thank a number of people. I want to thank everybody who watched in and submitted questions. According to my list, we have 70 questions, so I think we got through about 10. So sorry to those of you who submitted questions, but we didn't get a chance to ask them, but it was clearly a popular topic. I also want to thank my colleagues who did the organization for this, and in particular, Merlin Sibley, Alison Peacock, and Tad Thorburn. And finally, I want to thank Mike Mann again. Please go buy and read his book. It's full of fascinating stuff, and I think you'll come out feeling charged and really ready for battle with those forces who are trying to delay us in action. This recording of this event will be up on the Grantham Research Institute website very shortly. And have a good day. Thanks,
well,
Mike.
Thanks again. Thanks again to Bob and Grantham Institute and everybody who participated in this. And I hope we can continue this conversation online on social media. It's an ongoing conversation. So thanks everybody for being part of it.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike.